What is up, people? Welcome back to Thirsty Thoughts on Investing on the Dentist Who Invest page with myself, James Martin. I am here to talk about the time-honored traditions, lessons, values in investing that don't often get a platform, but they really, really, really should, because they're the consistent things that you can use, that have been used historically over and over and over again to make money. And today, I'm here to present to you a webinar on 3 short stories which will cause you to totally reframe how you see investing and how you see money. And you know what? Stories are so powerful, because if you can wrap a lesson around the story, around the story, guess what? People retain it so much better, and that is part of the power. And I hate it when people are willingly dismissive of stories and how useful they can be because they seem somewhat frivolous. You'll see what I mean whenever we come into this webinar, and you'll see what I'm talking about when I begin. So without further ado, let's go ahead and share my screen. Here we are. Thirsty Thoughts on Investing. As we know, 3 powerful stories. Let's jump straight in. Not financial advice, as we know, every single week. A little bit of a market update. So if you look on your BBC News app, or indeed any news app, you will see a whole host of information about Ukraine, what's going on there. There's no news like bad news. Obviously, our hearts go out to the people of Ukraine. Terrible humanitarian situation out there. Is really sad. We are going to look at it today from the point of view of how it is affecting our portfolios. We do not mean to be dismissive of the suffering of the people of Ukraine. That is the first thing on everybody's mind, of course, and that is what we are thinking of above and beyond everything else. But here today, we're looking at it from the perspective of finance. So when I see bad news stories, any negative news stories out there, and inevitably there's a dip in the market that follows. And the sad reality is that still there's too many people who are making decisions based on what they think is going to happen next. And really, historically, if you just sit back and look at the longer trends, the long-term trends, you'll know that out of every 10 years in the stock market, 8 of them go up. So even if there is a year that's negative, the key thing to understand is that you can never predict it 100%. The war in Ukraine could be over tomorrow. It could have started, it can start anytime it likes, and it can be over just as quickly. No one knows the future. That's like saying you have a crystal ball, and that manifests in our investing as well. And really, we cannot make any decisions based on this. The best thing that we can do is just keep on averaging our way in. Keep on averaging, keep on buying, keep continuously sticking to your guns. Do what you normally do in the market. Obviously, no financial advice here, but please do not either hold off or sell because of a news story. Who remembers when Trump got coronavirus last year? There was a sell-off for all of about a day. People were panicking. And then guess what? About 7 days later, the market had recovered and then some. That is a classic example, or that's an amazing example of why we cannot base our investment decisions off news stories. It's super important because no one even knows, one, if they're going to have an effect on the market, or two, what will happen next, even if they do have an effect on the market. And if you're, there's an analogy that I love. If you're the casino, okay, and you know that if you keep playing blackjack and you never change the rules for blackjack, then the house is going to win 8 out of 10 times and the punter is going to lose 2 out of 10 times. If you make yourself the house and not the punter, i.e. you keep making the rules and keep on investing and keep on knowing that you have history on your side, and that unendingly and unswayingly and overall things consistently go up, at least the right assets do. As I say, I cannot give financial advice on this webinar, but of course then we know that history is on our side, and that's how we take our psychology out of the game. So hearts go out to the people of Ukraine first and foremost in our thoughts. As far as our investing goes, I would not let this sway anything that you do. Remember, there is minimum market analysis on these webinars, on these Thursday Thoughts, and on Money Mondays. And the reason is because I don't genuinely think it's that much use to people, even though if you pick up a newspaper, you'd think otherwise, especially a financial newspaper. And that's not to say all the information in there is not worthwhile. It's just to say that a lot of it is informative insofar as it keeps us up to date with world events, but definitely not something that we want to use to decide on how we're going to play next. The best portfolios have this risk built in already. If you're a simple buy and holder and you know that it's going to go up, guess what? You've already accounted for that risk. Food for thought. So now we're going to jump into 3 stories about investing. There's some seriously powerful lessons in there. And you know what? I've always remembered these 3 stories because they taught me huge lesson. They taught me huge lessons. They taught me very powerful. They gave me a very powerful understanding of investing. There is some amazing things out there. There's some amazing understanding, and there's an amazing understanding that you can have of investing, which means that you're completely mellowed out. You're never going to be subject to the psychological pitfalls which everybody suffers from. And these 3 stories will illustrate that. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. Very powerful. First one, a jar of coffee. What has a jar of coffee got to do with investing? So let's imagine that you go to the supermarket every single week and you love your coffee. You're buying a jar of coffee every week, or a bag of coffee beans, whatever, it doesn't matter. And you pay £5 for 500 grams of coffee. Now let's say you spend that every single week, £5 on 500 grams of coffee. That's brilliant. You do that every week. You've always done it every week, and you've done it consistently. Now, what about if you go to the supermarket and all of a sudden that 500 grams of coffee is now £2.50? What do? What would any normal human being do in that instance? They'd at least buy 2. Maybe they'd buy even more because they know they're going to drink the coffee because they drank it long term, and they always have done, and they always will. So it's fair to say that that 500 grams of coffee is exactly the same in every single way, except it's now £2.50. So that is more value for your money. Now here's the thing. If you think about it, when we apply that logic to anything that we buy in the shops, we're basically saying that a unit of this coffee costs £2.50, or a unit of everything. A unit of coffee costs £5 normally, but in this instance, it costs £2.50. So why the heck is it that when we look at the stock market and certain assets and the price goes down and it becomes better value, do we buy less, or do we panic and sell? We would never do that with anything else in the whole world apart from investing and apart from the stock market. Now, please do your own research, of course. Make sure that you've bought the right things. Please make sure you've bought the right things. But if you think about it and you look at it from this lens, really isn't that an interesting perspective? It's the only thing in the whole world that when its value decreases, we panic. We actually don't buy it, okay? Anything else in the whole world we get excited about. And if we know that it's going to go, it always has done historically, continued to go up, then isn't that an interesting way of looking at it? A rising in price market is a declining in value market. Just like if the jar of coffee goes up, you'd buy less, right? But if the jar of coffee goes down, or i.e., if the market goes down, then actually that's an increase in value market, because we're buying units, not anything else. We're buying units in the exact same way, analogous to the coffee, exactly the same. And remember, these units only ever appreciate over long enough time frames. Please do your own research. Please know that you're buying the right asset. There's a few other variables that you have to chuck in there, but of course, that is the principle. You're trading a depreciating asset, i.e. your cash, for something that consistently appreciates. Absolutely mind-boggling, so interesting, yet that's how we all look at the stock market. Here's another one. The story of the laborer. Let's say I was building a house. Let's say I had you, the person who's watching this webinar, over to help me construct that house, and I paid you a laborer's wage. Let's say I paid you fairly well. Let's say I paid you £50 for an hour's work. And let's say you were building the house. You worked for me for 7 hours on one particular day. I got you in to cover somebody else who was not well. I hired you for 7 hours on one particular day. I paid you £50 an hour. That was the deal. We shake hands on it at the start of the day. You keep up your end of the deal. You do 7 hours to the minute, because I know, because I've clocked you when you entered the construction site and when you left. And consequently, no quibble, I hand over that £350 at the end of the day. So if you think about it, if your hourly rate is £50 and I've given you 7 times £50, you have 7 records of 1 hour's work. Okay, that's how your work is recorded. It's recorded in a tokenized form as cash. Cool, completely with me on that one so far. Now, here's the thing. How about if I came back to you, I called you up 2 weeks later and I said, hey, according to my records, you actually only worked 6 hours that particular day. Even though on that day, we both agreed that you worked 7 hours, you clearly remember doing it. I handed you over the money. I was content at the time, but now I'm saying to you, actually, you only worked 6 hours. I'll be having £50 back. What would you say to me? You probably have some pretty choice words. You probably wouldn't be too happy. You'd deny it. Think about it like this. What about if there was a way that I could bank transfer myself back that £50 without even asking you? Okay? What about if that could happen? That would be outrageous, right? That is something that happens every day when you store the record of your hard work as cash, because that's the record that you worked those 7 hours. And you know that you get £50 for every hour's work. You work for 7 hours, so therefore you get £350. You have 7 units of work. But I'm saying to you, actually, it's only 6 because I'm taking some of that money back. Now, how does that look? How does that work? That's inflation. That happens to your cash every single day. The record of your work which is staying the same and has always been a constant, it will be that way because you honestly did that work, and with integrity, you came to me and said you worked 7 hours, but the problem is the record of how that work's stored. That's the problem. That happens every hour of any day when you hold cash. Now, think about it like this. What if there was a better way? What about if there was another method of storing that record of your hard work? What about if I came to you in 2 weeks and I said, actually, my records show that you worked 8 hours that day. Here's 400 quid. Yeah? There's 400 pounds for you. Yeah? You couldn't believe your ears. You'd be like, I just got paid 50 pounds for nothing. Yeah? What about if you take that record of your hard work and you store it in another form which pays you? That's what investing can be. That's how investing works when you know the right methods. Now, naturally, it isn't as simple as that. It doesn't go up in a smooth line, and it's not going to be over a time frame of 2 weeks. It'll likely be over many years. It's a record of your work, which is going to be a constant. However, it gives you more hours. It increases the number of hours that you work with time because you know how it works, because you know what you're doing. Yeah? How crazy is that? Something that gives you more hours with time versus takes hours away from you, hours of labor away from you, those hours of labor that you worked. Yeah, that is the crazy thing. That is the most interesting way of looking at investing. And that right there was the biggest bombshell ever whenever I learned it. And imagine how cheesed off you'd be if I took that back from you, that money, that cash. Now, obviously, I can't physically take the cash from you. It doesn't really work like that. But the cash, the value of the cash and what it can buy, it goes down with time. So effectively, I'm stealing those hours back from you, but you have no consent to it. Taxation via inflation, everybody. Whereas assets, proper assets, appreciate and pay you more. You've just chosen to store that record of your hard work in another form that pays you with time. What is a better method? How about investing in indexes in the stock market, things that constantly appreciate with time? Yeah, it doesn't go up on a smooth line. Here's every single crash since the 50s in the stock market. Zoom out from these. Ukraine is this one of these tiny little blips up here. There's the coronavirus crash right there. See how tiny and minuscule that looks on the grander scheme of things? Exactly, because you're looking at this from a long-term perspective. Now, please just don't go out and jump in and buy something like this. There's a little bit more of a conversation to be had as to whether or not this works specifically for you, but particularly for people who are young and miles off thinking about retirement. The best way to grow your money, generally speaking, a 100% equities portfolio, invest in the great companies of the world, the companies that will pay you for owning them and that will adapt to market conditions. You're effectively buying the brains of all of those CEOs who will adapt their company to changing fortunes in the market, in the global economy, in the macro scale and on the micro scale. And if you're doing that, you're hedging yourself because you're spreading it amongst 500 of the greatest companies in America, 500 of the greatest companies in the world, and 500 or more brains, because that's the people who sit in those It's just an amazing way of looking at it. I love that story. So One more story, one final story. How wisdom accumulates. There's two people. One man both of them want to become an expert at a particular thing. They want to become an expert at anything. They want to become an expert at dentistry, let's say. So the first guy is 20. Both of them have very little time in their lives. Okay, both of them only have 3 hours a week to contribute towards their dentistry. The first guy says, okay, I've only got 3 hours a week. I'm going to start because I want to learn about dentistry. I want to begin. And I know the earlier the start, the better. The second guy says, nah, I won't be able to fully commit at this point. I won't be able to, in those 3 hours, I'd rather spend them on something else, or rather not think about it. I'd rather wait for 10 years until I'm really serious about it and then get there and then begin learning about dentistry. So that's what the second guy says. So they both have their different philosophies. But one guy says, okay, well, I want to just do a little bit now and continuously apply it. And then the second guy says, actually, I'd rather wait for 10 years until I can completely invest myself in it, until I can completely focus all of my time and effort on this particular thing. And that's fine. They both go their separate ways. 11 years later, they come back. They meet again. The first guy, who's been able to commit 3 hours, he's been able to understand that information, retain it, build on it, view the world through that perspective, have conversations with other people who are in dentistry, because he now has a knowledge base of dentistry. His knowledge has not only grown linearly because of those 3 hours, it's actually grown exponentially because of all the conversations that he's been able to have along the way. Yeah. That second guy, who has only spent 1 year learning dentistry by this point because he wanted to wait for 10 years in the first place. He's learning, don't get me wrong, he's putting in more hours, but he's not at the same position as the guy who's learned it already. The guy who's began learning straight away and began learning those 3 hours a week just from the get-go, even though he had less time overall. And the reason for that is the first guy's knowledge is compounding. It's growing exponentially because he's able to have those conversations. He's able to view the world through that lens. He's able to strike up conversations with other people in the dental world, and he's able to learn more, even though he has, well, surely because of the fact that he's been doing it for much longer than the other guy. What's the quickest way to becoming an expert? Is through doing. So if you think about it, we've all heard of the power of compounding. Because that first chap who started earlier, his knowledge has begun to grow exponentially. Whereas the second guy, he's waited 10 years and then he's began to learn. And even though he's put in more hours in a week, he's put in 20 hours in a week, his knowledge is still growing linearly because he hasn't had time to have those fortuitous conversations, those open book analysis, those sit downs with people who are experts, those things that come across completely by chance, scenarios that arise where he's had time to have those conversations with people, surely because he has got some skin in the game, or surely because he didn't have some skin in the game from the get-go, that person has seriously sabotaged himself. The first person recognizes the power of putting in a little bit of effort, but over longer periods of time, versus just focusing entirely on one thing and then hoping for the best and really not achieving the same results, even though you're being more devoted to it, but you're doing it over a shorter space of time. Now, what else works exactly like that? Compounding. If you think about it, those guys' knowledge, those two individuals, their knowledge has been compounding, okay? The first guy's knowledge has been compounding. Even though he's put in less effort, it's compounded at a greater rate. The second guy, he's went at it absolutely hammer and tongs, but he hasn't had enough time or exposure to the space. He hasn't even been able to see the world with the right pair of eyes. He hasn't been able to focus on it, disseminate his information, have those conversations that enable him to learn in many ways that he couldn't imagine, because he didn't know what he was looking for in the first place. So if you think about it, his knowledge has not yet had the chance to compound. And of course, when things compound, they grow exponentially, they don't grow linearly. So that person, the second person, will never catch up on the first guy, even though the first guy or girl or whoever has spent, as I say, maybe much less time overall studying than the second guy. Yeah, that's the point. That's the power of compounding, and that applies to money as well. So the earlier you start, even if it's with small amounts, the better it will be in the long run. Look at Warren Buffett's wealth. Warren Buffett's wealth is growing. Warren Buffett had 1.4 billion before his 56th birthday. Now he has 82 billion. He's made the vast majority of his wealth in the final 30 years of his investing career. So he's made, let's do the math super quick. He's made, about, let me see, 1/40 of his wealth, 1/40, which would be about 2% ish, 2.3%. He had 2.3 of his percent of his total wealth. He's made like 97 points whatever percent in the last 30 years of his investing career. That's the power. That's the power of investing. That's the power of compounding. The point is to start early, and the earlier you start, the better a chance you have at exponentially growing your money towards the end. And by the way, of course, money is not the only thing that compounds. Education, knowledge, relationships, all of those other things compound as well. And the point is just to start early. And you know what? Here's the thing about entrepreneurs. Here's the thing about people who are in business. They recognize the power of doing because of this effect. Most things in life compound. So in summary, see the lessons in these stories. So much of investing is based on seeing things in a different way. A lot of the things that are powerful to employ as skills or methods in the investing world are things that are completely counterintuitive to our day-to-day life. Those three stories will have illustrated that. Please ignore the day-to-day news. It's not there to help you. It's there to sell newspapers. Those two things are sometimes, well, almost always not the same thing. People are way more likely to pick up a newspaper if it shocks them, if it stuns them, if they think it's interesting. The standard headlines in your day-to-day newspapers are shock tactics. They're things that are there to scare us and frighten us. They will not report the consistently optimistic message of the stock market when you know what you're doing. It's a way more exciting headline to have something along the lines of this is a total calamity, this is a disaster, etc., versus actually patiently you can make gains over long periods of time if you just consistently wait and know what you're doing. And of course, that leads me into my final point, which is to play the long game always. Thanks so much for listening to this webinar. Lots of gems in there, lots of information. I shall see you all next week on Thursday Thoughts in Investing.